All right. Welcome, everyone. I'm Fatima coming to you from Santa Clarita Public Libraries. Thank you all for joining us for History Talks. Our topic of discussion tonight is historical fiction. If you have any questions for our panel, please type them into the Facebook chat box and I will relay them to our authors. Before we begin, I would like to provide a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the land the Santa Clarita Libraries are built on is the traditional territory of the Fernandeño Tataviam people. As we begin this history talk, this history is one that is important to acknowledge, and we honor their history and their ancestral grounds. We encourage you to research and discover the history of the Indigenous peoples whose land you are joining this program from virtually. You can find out more information about the many tribelate units who are the Fernandeño Tataviam Band of Mission Indians and their history at the website I will put in the chat. I will also include a link to the History Talks website where you can learn more about the authors with us tonight. Now I will turn it over to our moderator for this evening, Erin Davies.
Thank you very much. And I'm not going to waste too much time on my own introduction. I am a historical fiction fanatic, but I am here first and foremost to introduce these wonderful group of authors, and I'd like each of them to do their own little introduction. So Zenobia, would you like to go first?
Sure. I'm Zenobia Neal, and I write about the ancient world, and especially Greek and Roman gods having too much fun. And I've written 4 novels, and I'll be talking about a couple of them.
Wonderful. Zena, would you like to go next?
Sure. My name is Zena Marie Yule, and I write nonfiction for young people and fiction for everybody else. Some fantasy, romance, and action adventure. My latest fantasy is Blue Moon Rising, which is urban fantasy inspired by the Navajo people and their experiences in the 1860s. And also skinwalkers, which is a Navajo concept of kind of an evil witch. So that kind of worked together with the real history to become a fantasy that is serialized on Kindle Vella right now. So you can be a part of it coming out every week.
Awesome. Autumn, how about you?
Hi, everyone. I'm Autumn Bordeaux, and I write historical fiction, historical fantasy, historical erotica, chick lit, urban fantasy, and nonfiction.
Well, I am super glad to be talking to all of you tonight. And if I sound like a fangirl, it is completely genuine. I've read all of these authors and I love them all. So if I'm gushing, it's real. Fair warning. So just to get us into this, how did all of you start writing historical fantasy? Autumn, let's start with you.
I actually started with an urban fantasy. The first would be a contemporary urban fantasy, and that's my Merkaba series. So that's how I got into the fantasy genre. And then when I did my first historical fiction, it was historical erotica. And I started with Legends of Lust, which is a short stories of all the gods and goddesses and mythical creatures. And then as I was going through those, I'm like, some of these need a full novel, right? And so that's when I wrote Confessions of a Sheba Queen. And that is also historical erotica fantasy. And then I also weave them into my other stuff because I love myths and I love the supernatural.
Awesome. Zena, how about you?
Well, I have been a history fan since grade school. And so I went on to get a history degree at Arizona State University, and I got my master's in history at Cal State Northridge. And the ancient Mediterranean was my focus. So, of course, all that had to work into my my novel, City of the Dead, which is really inspired by, ancient Roman society and ancient Mediterranean society. So that's how it started.
Zenobia, how about you?
I think, so is the question how we got into historical fantasy?
Yep, that's the one.
I think I blame Anne Rice. When I was a teenager, I read all the vampire books. And so I thought that all good books or fun books had some historical, magical, fantastical, sexual innuendo elements. So I was always like, I always felt like a really good book would contain history, sex, and magic. So I've been inspired to always include those elements. And also, it's the closest we can get to time travel or going to somebody else's body. So I've always liked writing, but after I had kids, I really needed an escape. And I needed to get really far away, like 2,000 years away. So I started writing an erotic retelling of the myth of Cupid and Psyche. And I ended up adding a lot of magic in that book as well. Yeah.
So I feel like you need to have a bookmark promo that says history, sex, and magic. So if you haven't done that yet, do it, because that's awesome.
I'm gonna do that. Thank you, Erin.
You're very welcome. I don't charge any sort of fees for that. My ideas for free.
I'll send you some bookmarks.
Yes. See, this is how you do it, people. You get the bookmarks from the authors. Okay, so I want to ask about a balance between historical and fantasy. How do you balance those two genres? Because they don't naturally go together. So Zena, let's start with you.
Well, I tend to think that I write fantasy with historical elements. So, for instance, my latest is a story of a coyote shapeshifter in present day California and the Navajo Nation. But it was inspired when I read a blog post from, I think it was the Archives, National Archives, where they talked about the long walk of the Navajo people in the 1860s, which I was born and raised in Arizona, and I never heard of this. Basically, it was kind of like a Trail of Tears, where the people had the cavalry, chase them from their land to eastern New Mexico. It was lots of death and sickness, and it was awful. They did eventually get to go back to their homeland, which is a good story. But anyhow, that inspired the story. So it's some of the book takes place there, but the majority is in the today's world and has fantasy elements in it. So I know, like our other authors, it's probably kind of the other way around, more historical setting with fantasy added to it. Is that right?
Autumn, what about you? Is that right?
So is the question, how do we balance it? Is that, that was the question?
Where do you find the balance between historical and fantasy in your novel?
I don't think I try to balance it. I think what I do is different for every story. So, for example, in Confessions of a Sheba Queen, right? She actually is, or her mythology is that she was part genie, or maybe full genie, or came from a genie. And so basically that aspect of her becomes part of her character, part of the mythology. So I use it in that way. But I balance it by having, the historical fiction aspect, the topography, the customs, the history as we know it, to be as accurate as I could make it. So there was a lot of, history, but the mythological part, the genie part, is like part of her character. So that's one way that I use it. Another way that I use it is that I kind of maybe weave some enigmatic features of mythology into a story. And we can see that with the Impaler's Wife. And in that, really, it's we have the Strigoi, which are the Romanian and Hungarian bloodsuckers. And then we have this thing called the Solomonari, who are actually descendants of the Wolf clan or whatever you want to call it. And so they were masters of transformation. And so I weave that into the Gothic element of a very, very historically accurate story. So that was a different kind of balance, right? And then with my with my latest one, which is not historical fiction, but it's straight chick lit, we've got goddesses. All the characters, the main characters, are goddesses, and yet they are, well, they're ex-goddesses because they get fired because they're no longer relevant. So they are a strong part, but the setting, some of it, the historical portion tends to be more a little bit of backstory and shows up in their dialogue. So then that balance becomes the dialogue when they discuss, what their ancient purpose was and how they can now apply it to a modern world where nobody needs it anymore, right? And sorry, this is a long answer. And so in Legends of Lust, also historical erotica, every story is based on some god or mythical creature. So it's like full board mythology, no holds bar. Okay. And then in my urban fantasy, which is contemporary, the mythological creatures and some of the characters that keep coming back in all of the series, they play a part in mythology and in because she's a mythological, basically bounty hunter. The mythological beings actually are, the antagonists. So when you ask for a balance, I really feel like, at least for me, it just depends on what exactly I'm writing that way. I know it was a long answer, but.
That's actually really interesting. I like that you let the story kind of come to life on the page during your writing process. What about you, Zenobia? How do you find balance?
Well, I feel like actually historical fiction and fantasy have a lot of crossover because both involve a lot of intense world building, and you need to really weave stuff together to make a solid world. And I also feel like the time and the place show the beings. So my second novel, The Genie's Last Wish, here I'm going to show you the picture, is about a eunuch in the Ottoman Empire who is given a genie in a bottle by a mysterious woman. And so for me, I feel like, even though I've read good books where genies are other, like I've read an urban fantasy about a genie in Pittsburgh, I think, and it was really good. But for me, because I'm writing historical, it would have to be in a place where the jinn existed. And when I write Greek or Roman mythological retellings, the gods are operating on their own system, their own rules. So you can put, like Autumn does, you put goddesses anywhere, but they once lived in a place where they had those systems too. So it's you have to just make sure that it's cohesive for the world that you've created.
Awesome. It's really interesting. I'm listening to all your answers, and I keep on thinking about our land shout out at the beginning of the call. And what I'm getting, especially with Zina's answers, you can understand a lot of a culture, a historical culture, through their mythologies and their fantasies and their religions. How do you think your books contribute to those cultural understandings? Autumn, let's start with you.
How do they contribute to the cultural understandings?
Do you think you can read?
You want to elaborate?
I can. Do you think that you can read your novels and understand the culture that you're writing about better through the fantasy elements that you incorporate?
I think it really depends on the kind of novel that you're looking at. I mean, for sure, you have to know your mythology. And you definitely have to be familiar with culture, but then there is so much crossover that the more you know, the more you can play with some of those mythologies. For example, an Irishman's leprechaun is a South American person's duende, el duende. So in a lot of ways, it reflects the culture, but then there is also so much crossover. But really, mythology is our history. Our earliest history stems from, Epic of Gilgamesh, right? That all those things. We have Inanna from Mesopotamia. So if you're going to bring in a mythological creature or god or goddess, they're going to have some kind of background, right? They're going to have family. They're going to have things that they've done or said or did, some power. And I think that gives the author poetic license, but also it needs to be, I feel like when my readers read about a mythological creature or a god, a lot of them will Google it. And I love that, because then they're going to learn more and they're going to see what I pulled, what I added to the missing parts. And I think that's fun. So you want to give them something substantial, but then also add in the missing parts and make them real.
I think that might be my basis for loving this particular subgenre. I'm also going to pick your brain later to get all those translations and pronunciations right, because you seem to have nailed them, and my tongue doesn't work that way. Zena, what about you? Do you think people can understand more about the native culture by reading your books?
Yes, I think so. My latest project. Well, I mentioned I was born and raised in Arizona, and my dad worked for Indian Health Service. So we were friends with a lot of different, native peoples from different tribes, and we moved up to the Apache Reservation, one of the Apache reservations in Eastern Arizona. That was kind of a way to get the culture, it kind of sinks in when you live in a place. And of course, traveling, the Navajo Nation is, the Monument Valley. It's just such a beautiful kind of haunting atmosphere, and, red sand and red canyons and mesas and all that. So there was the personal experience that helped develop the culture, but also a lot of research too. Research that was taken from oral history from native peoples who, 1860 was a long time ago, but the stories kind of came down through the generations. And kind of as an aside, one of the really impactful things about the long walk and this blog post that I read about it is that the government was displaying a treaty that was made between the government and the Navajo people that ended up in them coming back to their sacred land. And so they displayed the treaty for the tribe and for people to come and look at it. And there were just, dozens and dozens of people, and they're still very emotional about it because this is their family. A lot of people died. It was very traumatic. So in that way, kind of the research really helps to make it come alive. And in Blue Moon Rising, the events that happened during the long walk are the catalyst for the coyote shapeshifter's story. So it works into to the rest of the story pretty well. So
if I start posting pictures from Monument Valley, you know why.
Okay.
It's all your fault. Zenobia, what do you think readers can take from your books?
Well, I think that anytime you read about another culture that you haven't thought a lot about, it gives you more insight, or at least a starting place. In my third book, The Queen of Warriors, well, in all my books, my characters are sexually fluid because in the past, people didn't look at sexuality like we do now. And so one of my friends who read my book was like, oh, so everybody back then was like bi. And I was like, yeah, kind of. I mean, they wouldn't think of it that way because they would just think of it as like people could be attracted to whoever. And it wasn't like you have to have, if you like men, you can't like women, or vice versa. So when she said that, I felt like I had accomplished something, because it makes me really crazy when people are like, people were gay in the ancient world, and it's like, yeah, duh. But also, they weren't what, like there's just a different way of thinking about sexuality, and it wasn't just one thing. I mean, I'm sure for some people it was, but like the whole way of thinking about it was completely different. And so that's just one example of like a way to think about it. Also, I think we tend to think of ancient Greece as one thing instead of many different city-states. And we also think of like of a time and place, like Sparta is only 300. It's like, well, what about 500 years later? What about, this different time period? So I like to think about that too. And when I wrote The Genie's Last Wish, I looked into the Ottoman Empire and into the harem of the Ottoman Empire, this place where like we imagine women are, they're slaves to this one sultan, and that like the narrative is often that they want to do nothing more than give the sultan a son, like that's their big thing. And so I wrote about characters who enjoy just lying around and drinking coffee and smoking hashish and eating pastries, and some other characters who are just checking out the other girls and have no interest in the sultan at all. And so I liked, and that's from a book I did when I did research. There was this part that talked about how like the girls would seek comfort in each other, and just read each other poetry and eat opium. And I was like, well, there are worse things. So I mean, I like taking a kind of dominant narrative and flipping it and looking at it from a different perspective.
It's a theme with all of your answers, that you can kind of interpret these experiences and these histories that are supposedly well known in a very different light if you have the guts really to explore this supposedly unbelievable element that they all subscribe to. So that kind of plays into my next question, and that the historical fiction community as a whole has this really, really strict adherence to fact, to the point where it's almost snooty when you say you write historical fantasy and people look at you like, wait, what? That's not real historical fiction. And it's completely unfair because this genre does things that traditional historical fiction just can't. Mm-hmm. So I want to ask, what drew you to this side of the genre, this little corner that it is so unique and special and fun? Zenobia.
Well, I've always liked magic and I've always liked Greek mythology. So there's always going to be, I love writing about the ancient gods. That's always really amazing for me. And also looking at them from different perspectives as well. So like the god of love is really stupid when it comes to love, and he might need a mortal to teach him what it means. For The Genie's Last Wish in the Ottoman harem, I was like, this is so harsh. I need to add magic. Because being a eunuch surrounded by beautiful women just seemed really hardcore. And so to kind of help myself, I needed to have a magical character. But it just, I had the thought one day, like, what would happen if a eunuch was given a genie in a bottle? What would he wish for? Like, it seems really obvious, but how would that work out? And then in other books, in The Queen of Warriors, I have a vengeful ghost, because that character was like, I'm here, I'm going to haunt you, and you're going to get redemption. And then in my most recent book, Ariadne Unraveled, it's just a look at the story of Ariadne, but with Dionysus instead of Theseus.
Awesome. I'm all for vengeful ghosts anytime, anywhere. Give it to me, I will go with it. How about you? Why did you decide that you needed to write this genre?
Hey, Autumn?
I said Zena. Sorry.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. Well, I've always loved fantasy, of course, history, and when you read literature from other cultures and past cultures, there's a lot of fantasy in it. Like, for instance, Beowulf, that has a historical setting, and attitudes from the time, but also like monsters and monster women and, all these fantastical things. And we would say the same about, like Navajo creation myth, and how there was, first man and first woman, the way that the corn played into it, the god figures, coming up through various worlds until they got to our world, and had to battle nasty monsters and stuff. So I think they kind of work together in a lot of ways. And what Zenobia touched on before, with historical fiction and with fantasy and science fiction too, I guess, you have to create a whole world. You can't rely on, what everybody knows about today's world.
Right.
Well, except for my latest has that, but and some of Autumn's fiction too. But you have to, think about the religion, think about the economy, think about, the food and the clothing and all these different elements that would be in this, in these societies, and that are often different from what we're used to.
Okay. What about you, Adam?
I think that mythology and historical fiction go together like peanut butter and jelly.
Yep.
And I'll tell you why. I think it's an escape. It's magical. We wish there could be magic. We wish there could be those beings in the world. Like, we want to believe, right? And I think it feels like the mystical, spiritual part of our soul. And also, like, it stirs the primitive aspects of it. But really, I think in a lot of ways, the mythology actually, I think it touches the sacred in all of us. And so I think that's why we love it.
I think that's another bookmark in the making right there.
Can I add something to that?
Of course.
I think that it's like, in addition to that, it's like we want those creatures, but for me, it's really nice that they don't know what's happening either, or like that they have faults, and like the Greek gods are, are very problematic. And so, I mean, I feel like that's one of the reasons the story of the Iliad is so popular still, in a way, because the gods are all like petty and bickering. I mean, it's weirdly comforting to think like nobody's in control, and like these divine beings are silly and foolish and cantankerous as well. So I like that aspect as well.
I love that you talk about characterization, because it's kind of another question that I have. Do you guys think that these supernatural elements, the fantastic elements of your characters, make them stronger in terms of characterization in your stories? Zenobia, let's start with you.
Yeah, I definitely think that I do, because I was trying to think of it. I mean, I was actually thinking of, since it's October and Halloween, I was kind of thinking of like horror, like just classic horror movies, and how a lot of times those characters are a little bit more just one-dimensional evil, and how in novels and historical fantasy, a lot of times it's great because the characters have really intense motivations that match their time periods. So I feel like that gives them more depth. And also, like, just because you're a magical creature, I mean, the idea of the djinn being this magical creature that is also a slave in a place where all these women and men have been enslaved, but they're like in a gilded cage. So it's just like, it flips everything we think about. We think about magical creature as being almighty, but it's like they've been harnessed by a mortal who has control and makes bad choices. So that like adds this element of irony, which is really compelling.
And it's definitely not what you see day in and day out from the rest of the genres, fantasy or historical fiction.
Yeah.
Autumn, what about you? How do the supernatural or fantastic elements play to the strengths or weaknesses of your characters?
I think you really, I mean, you did talk about characterization, so you have to handle each character as their own, like you would any character, right? And so you have to give them strengths and weaknesses. You have to give them a purpose, through the plot of the story. But then also, at least for me, I like to make them stronger at the end, not magically so much or supernaturally, but they are, but it doesn't come magically. It comes because they have some kind of like self-revelation, or they discover the power of love, or they decide they finally realize their full potential, and or maybe they have a duty to mankind or community. So that inner soul stuff, that epiphany makes them stronger at the end, just like I think with any character. Mm-hmm. They have that higher purpose. And I think that kind of fills our soul as well.
So I like that. Zena, what about you?
Yes, I had never thought of that question kind of like that before, but I know in my books, City of the Dead has magical assassins coming after the characters. And then, of course, Blue Moon Rising has also some nasty skinwalker witches and all that. And I think it takes, you have the everyday life of a character, and the supernatural just like comes in off, out of nowhere for them, and they have to deal with this. It's something that is unexpected, and it will reveal their inner, character strengths and weaknesses, just because it's so off the wall to them. They may have heard about things, but to experience it, that's much different. And to have to run for your life or fight some, big, horrible, witch who's flinging things at you, it reveals who you are, and also brings up strengths and, maybe fears and weaknesses too that were not apparent otherwise.
Like it. We have a really interesting question in the chat, so I'm just going to dive right in. So, curveball, guys. How do you decide when you have invested enough in your world building? Where is your limit when you are working in an environment that effectively doesn't have them? In historical fiction, we have a record that we have to stick to, but in fantasy, you have rules that you can break. So where do you draw your lines? Tina, let's start with you.
Wow. Well, research, I could just research till the cows come home. And that kind of, I guess that, like in fantasy, it can put some structure in place by not really having a lot to research. You can read other books and read literature and mythology and whatnot from them. But history is continuously evolving. New discoveries are made, new, scrolls from the ancient world, or archaeological dig, brings up something. And so for me, it's like you could be reading that again and again, over and over. Whereas fantasy is a little more limited, if that makes any sense. Like, for instance, for Blue Moon Rising, I just kept reading about, Navajo culture, Navajo beliefs, individual stories that came down through families. And it's like, I could just keep this up forever. So I guess if you ever want to get something finished, you have to, it has to not necessarily come out in the story, but you have to have the background in your mind. So if you feel like you've created a society and characters in a plot that are sufficiently interesting and real, then they can be informed by all that background, even though it might not actually make its way into the story.
I feel like that's an open invite to like message you randomly saying, hey, come out of the research rabbit hole. I want the book. Come on.
Yeah.
Autumn, what about you? Where do you draw your lines?
Well, I think I'm gonna like do a bunch of things that you make sure you have, and when you have all those things, then maybe you know that's enough. And so, like Zena says, you want to study up on the mythology, and you want to use lots of different sources. You want to be mindful of cultural nuances. Okay, you want to be very mindful of the historical elements. You want to know your audience. That's important. Know your reader. Fill in the gaps of the mythology, and select. Another one would be select which elements you want to focus on with their, with their superpowers or whatever it is. Give them a personality, give them a purpose, give them relatives or family or backstory. And then I think this is important, give them a way to use their abilities incorrectly and correctly. And then make them real, make them relatable.
Nice. I love that this is recording because I don't have to take notes. It's like I can rewind and get the answers. Zenobia, what about you? Where do you draw your lines?
Those are all really great points that you guys made. It's hard to figure out. It's not like a cake where you can like just put the toothpick in and be like, okay, it's ready. I feel like for me, I mean, getting into a world that's so foreign, like the ancient world or the Ottoman Empire, takes time. And I mean, I think all historical fiction writers have the experience of doing a bunch of research and then being like, oh, I can't use this. But it has to be like right for your character and compelling for your character. And I feel like you have to have enough of the walls to make it work, but you don't have to know everything. And sometimes like you do a lot of research and you're like, oh, but like when I was writing The Genie's Last Wish, there was a lot of information about like what the Sultan ate every day, but there was very little information about what life was like for eunuchs and the girls in the harem. So like I'm looking at the world like this, so what was their life like? And I found out that they would have like these sherbet drinks that were really exciting. A lot of them were made out of rose petals. And then they'd also put like exciting things in their hookahs to flavor the water, and different ways of eating opium. I did try to like find out what does it taste like to eat opium, and couldn't get a good answer on Quora, but I kept finding things to tell me with my heroin addiction. I was like, it's research. I really don't want to eat opium, but what does it taste like?
I feel like your search history has got to be really interesting.
Yeah. It's not great. And then there are a bunch of like, I've been researching the Hellenistic world. And so I'm like reading these books at the gym, and I'm like looking up these vocabulary words that are all random and very like stylized for that period of time. So, but I feel like it's just kind of like you get to a point where you just know. I know that that's not a great answer for like another writer. It's like, you just know when you're finished. But for me, like I do a lot of research, but I also kind of try and limit myself. I don't know, like 15, but like instead of just going out of control. Because like when you get to the point where you have conflicting sources or conflicting information, you're like, okay, but what would my character need? What is my character eating? How are they getting around? So that's kind of, and then you just, when your plot kicks in, you also are like, okay, I got it.
Nice. Okay, so you all just gave me a lot of great information on what you should do. Let's talk about, just for a second, things you shouldn't do. What mistakes have you made? What mistakes have you seen other authors make? Zena, let's start with you.
Well, I have actually, this example does not come from fantasy. It comes from a historical romance. But I read this lovely, it felt very accurate romance that took place in medieval times. And the author chose to use this language that was very I mean, it was very dense and thick, and it was like they really spoke back then. But then a lot of people, I mean, I loved that about it. It made it so real. It made, it just informed, it made this whole society come to life for me. It was part of it. But a lot of readers complained, and then she went back and she wrote it again using dialogue that was more understandable. I was like, why would you do that?
Wow.
I mean, it was a wonderful story, but come on, I don't know. I just found that to be, of course you want to please your readers, but you can't please all of your readers all the time. And so learning how to, set those boundaries and being okay with it is really helpful, I think.
I feel like that's really important, especially when you find like a unique turn of phrase that just it tickles you in a way that's really unique, but you have to balance, okay, who is my audience? Where is this going? And I get one shot at it. I don't get to rewrite it again.
Yeah.
What about you, Zenobia? What mistakes have you noticed or have you made yourself?
Well, I'm sure I've made a lot of mistakes myself, but I think that a mistake specifically for historical fantasy or any kind of fantasy is failing to weave in or incorporate the magic in the beginning, or like to make a story where like suddenly someone's just like, that HBO show Carnival from a long time ago, there's this scene where like he brings somebody back to life, but all the fish die. And so like that set up early, it was from a long time ago, but like it set up early, there was a balance, right? That he can like save people, but there has to be a sacrifice. So it's like when you set that up in the beginning, like this person has magic, but it comes at a cost. So like, you can make a wish for the djinn, or you can take a wish from the djinn, but it comes at a cost. And the wishes don't always, it's like the monkey's paw, right? The wishes don't always come out the way they're supposed to. So if you're writing a book and there's no magic, and then like a third of the way through, you're like, somebody does magic, readers are disappointed, because it's like, that's why you want to know the genre, because it's a contract between you and the reader. You're like, I'm going to tell you this kind of story. And if you're like, I'm just going to tell you this is history, this is historical fiction. And then you're like, and then a wizard appeared and blah, blah, blah. And also, I think sometimes people try and use magic as a way to save a plot hole, and that definitely doesn't work. So those are things to avoid.
You heard it here first, guys. Autumn, what about you? What mistakes have you seen or made yourself?
I think just like in general, and issues maybe that people would have with that would be just not making the characters real enough or relatable enough to the reader, right? And then I think not giving them a purpose or a reason, like a good reason to be in the plot. Like, why are they necessary to the plot or to the main characters? Maybe they act as a foil, whatever it may be. I think giving them too much power could be problematic. And Zenobia touched on this, giving them power that magically saves the day. Deus ex machina comes in like in the Greek and saves everything. Or like Zenobia said, trying to get that out of a plot hole that people are like, that's not fair, right? And I like giving them, for me at least, I like giving my mythological creatures a higher power that they have to answer to, so they're not all powerful. So even they have somebody over them. That makes them a little less all-powerful.
Laws make characters so much more interesting no matter what they are, even if it's just a limitation on what they can do. As a reader, those kind of things pull me in. It's like, oh, how are you going to work around that? We do have an interesting question in the chat, so I'm going to ask, have you guys ever gone down the research rabbit hole and found that one of your minor characters or someone you thought was going to be a supporting character is whispering in your ear that they need a bigger part? And if so, what have you done? Autumn, let's start with you.
When I was writing Legends of Lust, which is the short story erotic collection, one of the stories I was writing was about that that very mystical, magical meeting between Solomon, King Solomon, and the Queen of Sheba. I mean, there's so much artwork about it, right? There's so many stories in 3 different Coptic, Jewish, Islamic, and Christian religions. They each have their different story and their different artwork and their different portrayals. And I was writing this story, and it's like she came out of the Word document. It's like, I need my own story. And so by the end, after finishing writing that 20-page short story, I'm like, I must tell her story. She told me I must tell her story. And so I guess there you have it. But when you talk about like the background of the deity or the being is more interesting, I think just by virtue of them being mythological and supernatural, they are more interesting, and that's when you give them their own story.
Like that. What about you, Zena?
Well, I have had that happen where a minor character kind of says hello, and recently, yeah, look at me. I'm coming to the end of Blue Moon Rising, the climax of the story, and the characters have moved from one location to a new location. So that gives you the opportunity to bring new characters into the mix. And one of them has some shamanic magical types of abilities. And he's very tied into the tragedy of what happened in the Long Walk, what happened later to Native peoples. And I really would love to tell his story because he would just be a really great character. But I have to be careful because he's a minor character, Mm-hmm. This is not the place for him to, go off and have his adventures. So, I mean, I guess you just have to kind of be patient, make a little note, set it aside, maybe for the next, if I have a sequel or a series, maybe. yes. Like Autumn said, you might get your own book. And I find it, like, for instance, with City of the Dead, people who read it, it's a standalone book. And you're like, oh, well, when is it? When are you going to have a sequel? When is, what's going to happen to these people? And I really feel like that is telling me that I made characters that were so relatable and so people had such affection for, that they want to see what happens to them in the future. I can't always, write another story because it takes me a long time to do them because I want to do them just right. But it's part of being, I guess, a creative person. You get a lot of different ideas and a lot of different inspirations, and you just have to kind of sort through them and until you ones that are really going to work for your stories.
This is going to sound a little self-serving because I am a reader, but if one of us is saying, one of my peers is saying, do it, it's a really big hit. I'm just saying. Zenobia, what about you? Have you had a character just kind of jump out at you and say, I need to be written about?
I have had several. So in my most recent novel, Ariadne Unraveled, it's very shiny. But so I'm writing about Ariadne, who's famous for the Minotaur and Theseus and Dionysus, but everybody's favorite character is actually the leopard. Which is funny because I was trying to combine a bunch of like conflicting mythological stories about Ariadne and Dionysus. I read somewhere that Ariadne was one of the women, like is the person who died in more different ways in Greek mythology than anybody else. And so I was trying to rectify all these conflicting myths, and the leopard was like my own made up character, and she was like everybody's favorite. The other thing in this book is Hephaestus, the god of the forge, kind of pushed his way in as well. He and Dionysus were really good friends, and he ended up becoming this full character that I hadn't foreseen finding out more about. And it was interesting because I thought about like volcanic soil and wine and all of these different things that I hadn't thought about before. And the island sacred to him is Lemnos. And I was like, oh my God, because he's twice fallen and Dionysus is twice born. And so they call each other by their nicknames in my book, like, hey, twice fallen, hey, twice born. And so Hephaestus was thrown out of Olympus twice. The first time, I mean, and again, there are conflicting myths about this too. Like he was born with a club foot, which was a big deal because he was the only god who was imperfect, or as the Greeks said, deformed. And so Hera was like, oh, and also she might have had him on her own to prove to Zeus that she could have a baby on her own, the way he had Athena out of his head. So she threw him off of Olympus. And then later he went back to Olympus and he intervened in a fight between Zeus and Hera. And then Zeus threw him off Olympus and he landed on Lemnos, and the people there like took care of him. And there was a huge volcano and a huge forge. So when I started writing this novel, I thought it was just going to be about Crete, which is really fun. But I ended up going around the Aegean too, because Hephaestus, who might have built the first robot, and also went around in like a golden chariot designed by with golden women. So it was pretty fascinating. And he was like the only god that had a job. So I ended up like writing way more about Hephaestus than I ever thought I would. But he was just like such a fascinating character. So
I like that you mentioned him because he stands out in the book to me. So that was kind of fun that you actually brought him up that way. We've kind of talked a little bit about mistakes you can make and how to draw your boundaries, but do you have any other advice that you would give to a writer of historical fantasies? Autumn, let's start with you.
I think it would just kind of be what we talked about, previously with, be mindful of the cultural nuances and do your history and that kind of thing. And I think it's just, as with any good story, you have to make them a fully fleshed out character with the weaknesses, with the strengths, with the character arc, and just be mindful and decide how you're going to use them. I think that may be like what parts are you going to use? And really that depends if it's a side character, a main character, but even as a main character, you have to decide, what elements you want them to have or not have, to fill in the gaps in the history. And so I think that's a lot of it,
Zenobia, what advice do you have?
I think, like anything, read other books in your genre first, like The Golem and the Genie, or the Djinn and the Genie. I know that the Interview with the Vampire series is not considered historical fantasy. Why or why not? I don't know. But just read a lot of books in your genre. I think like you need the time and the place. For me, the time and the place kind of generates the plot and the character. I think like if you're just like, I want to write about vampires in the French Quarter or in, the French Revolution, you might want to just keep going with like, keep brainstorming. But like, if the character comes to you and they're like, I was going to be guillotined, but then a vampire bit me, like you might have something. But I think what's important is to have a cohesive story that works for you, that something about it really touches you and is really intriguing to you.
Zena, what about you?
Well, I think that the historical parts and the fantastic part can maybe blind some writers, because you need to have a solid story structure. You need to understand the hero's journey, the arc that characters go through to accomplish something. And that's really the foundation of great fiction, Otherwise, you just have, mythology or real history, which doesn't always, end up in a neat little box like our stories do. And which changes frequently as different scholars come in with different ideas and different research. So learning story structure, basic story structure, it's something that it's like building a house. You have to have those, that foundation has to be strong enough, and then you can put in the, you can paint the walls and you can put up the drapes and stuff. So that's what I would say. Yeah.
That's good.
You also some great advice, but with that, I think we are right at time. So
Great.
You are correct. I'm going to pop back in here. That was a wonderful, engaging discussion. Thank you all so much. I feel like I learned so much about how you guys go about sculpting historical fantasies. And I think that we did have a lot of viewers engaged in the discussion there. So I'd really like to thank you all again. And I just have some announcements. Just a reminder that next month's talks, History Talk, will be on Thursday, November 4th at 6:30 p.m. And the title for that is The Many Hats of Indie Authors. Yes, we have some thank yous from the comment section there. And just another reminder, I also invite you all to check out our website at santaclaritalibrary.com/events to see other programs from the library, and wish you all a great night. Thank you. Bye, everyone.